Hello guys, and welcome back to my video. So in this video we are going now to start working on the sending job applications to companies, right? So the first thing that we are going to do is we are going to be retrieving the job vacancies, right? So as you can see, we have a tab here with the pending, accepted, then rejected vacancies, right? So without wasting much of time, let's start developing our application. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is, if we go inside our features folder, right, let's create another folder. We already have another folder called applications, right? So what we can simply do is we can simply change this to a scaffold widget, right? And then after that, now what we need to do is let's create another subfolder inside our features folder. Let's just name it model, and then let's create another folder again, and then this folder is going to be our repository. Okay, and then let's create the last folder, which is going to be our widgets folder, right? Okay, so the first thing that we need here is we need a models folder, right? Application model, right? So basically what we are simply going to do is let's go inside our resume model, and then let's just copy our resume model, and then let's go and then let's create another file, and then I'll just name it application model. So let's just paste it below, right? So, and then what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to change this to application model. And then let's also change the line next. And then we also need to change our model class from resume to application. Okay, so now let's just get rid of the right. So here what we need is we need an ID, which is we need it, and then we also need status, which is going to be application status, and then also need a company object, company model, company, and then we also need a resume object. And then we need a user ID. And then we also need a vacancy, right? So we already have a user ID here, right? And then I think that's all for our model. So let's just make sure I change this to application model also. Let's go to our terminal, right? And then what we can simply do is let's run build runner to just generate our application model. So we are having a problem with application model from JSON. Okay, so let's get, we made a typo here. Okay, and then let's regenerate our classes again. Okay, you can see now we have generated our model classes. Now let's go inside our repository folder. Let's create an application repository file. So let's just create a class named application repository. So, and then we need a local auth repository, which is going to underscore local auth repository. And we also need an HTTP client, right? And then now what we need is we need an auth repository constructor, right? Let's create an auth repository constructor. And then so let's just import HTTP package, right? And then basically what we're simply going to do is simply going to set our local auth repository to our local auth repository, and then our client to our client, right? So it's supposed to be application not auth or constructor. All right, so the first method that we are going to create is the method for sending our application. All right, so it's going to be a method of type future, and then either, and then we need to handle the failure. So if there's a failure, we're going to just display text up failure. Otherwise, we just return our application module, right? Then send application. And then it's gonna check the first thing. Our first variable is going to be a vacancy ID. And then we also need a resume ID. And then we also need company ID. And we also need a user ID. And we also need a status, application status, right? All right. So first, let's import application model, and then let's import fp.package, right? So now the first thing is we need to create request headers. So it's going to be a map of type string, and then we're just going to rename it request headers. And then content type. content type is going to be application /JSON. And then now we need to provide authorization header. Because if we don't, we are going to get like a 401 status code telling us that we are not authorized to make the request, right? And then we'll then provide local auth repository to get user token, right? Okay. So now that we are done, now that's the URL. So we need the base URL and then applications URL, right? And then after that, we need a response. So the response is we are going to just await client. We just make a post request to provide our URL first, and then after this, what we need are headers, which is simply going to be request headers. And then the body, which is going to JSON encode, right? We are simply, so here we simply need we need to add an async modifier, right? So let's add an async modifier. All right, so we are going to encode our object. So we need a vacancy ID to send an application, right? So we just vacancy ID. We also need a resume, which is going to be our resume ID. We also need a status, application status, right? And then we also need company ID, because we need to know to allow us to send to a particular company, right? So it's company ID, and then the user ID will tell us which user sent the application. So it's user ID. All right, so now that we are done, now what we just need to do is we just need to decode our data, our body, right? So it's going to be response.body. All right, so now that we are done, so now we are just going to launch a try. We are just going to create a try catch block, right? A try catch block, and then what we basically need to do is we need to catch an error, right? So catch an error, we're simply going to return, and then app failure, then e.toString, right? Right, we are done with this one. So now with the try catch block, what you're simply going to do is we are going to simply check if our response.status code is equal to 200, or our response.status code is equal to 201, right? So basically, if our response is successful, simply going to return right. And then we are simply going to return application model from JSON. Then I'm simply going to pass in the data, right? And then else, then app failure, then data, then message, right? Okay, So now that we are done with handling the method for sending our application, right? The next method that we need to deal with is method for getting our application, right? So basically what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to create a feature. And then either, if you still remember from our error handling earlier on, then app failure, checking app failure, and then we are retrieving a list of applications, right? So we are retrieving a list of application, and then so just say get user application. So to get a user application, we are going to get it by their user ID, right? We are going to get it by their user ID, and then a synchronous function. And then what we are simply going to do is we need to grab our request headers right there, right? So let's grab our request headers. Let's just paste them there, and then first thing first, we need to get a URL. And then we need to specify our base URL and then our route, right? So our route is going to be config application by user URL, right? And then /, and then we are simply going to append the user ID. Let's add the user ID. Right, user ID there, right? And then after this, what we're going to do is we need a response. To get our response, we simply have to await our client. And then we just need to get URL and then headers, and then we just provide the request headers. And now we need to decode JSON, our body, right? Right, and then let's create a try catch block. And the message is going to be e.toString, right? All right. So now that we are done, now what we need to do here is we are simply going to check if our response status code is equal to 200. So if it's equal to 200, then we're simply going to retrieve our applications, right? So we're going to simply retrieve right, and then our application, right? So let's go back to our application model. We need to change this to applications from JSON to applications from JSON. Right, so let's go back and then applications from JSON, and then we will simply provide our data. Okay, so now we are done with the application repository. I think we are still getting an error somewhere. So I think saying what the point null, I think it's because okay, we didn't handle the else part. So else we are simply going to return right, left, and then we're simply going to return the message. All right. So now what we need to do now is to take care of this application repository. So let's create an application repository provider, right? Just go to provider, then check in a reference, and then what we simply have to do here is let's just return an application repository, right? So the client, what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to watch HTTP provider, and then also for need also for the local auth repository, right? So we are simply going to watch local auth repository provider. Okay. All right, so now that we are done with our local auth repository, now we'll move on to our auth controller, to our applications controller, right? Okay, guys, so now that we have completed working on our repository, right, now it's time on to work on the controller, right? So let's just create a subfolder inside our application code controller, right? And then now let's create a file called application controller, right? All right, so let's just create the file. So application controller, which is going to extend the async notifier. It's going to async notifier, and then it's going to get an async value of type void, because we are not going to return anything, right? And then now let's initialize our application repository. And then let's create another one for local auth repository. Okay, and then now let's create an override function. Let's create an override function which is an async value of type void, which is our build function. So our build function is more of like an init state. When our application controller is called, the build function is the one that runs first, right? And then you should make sure that it should start with the same type as this async value here. If we have an async value, then we want to make sure that our build function is going to be of type async value. If we have, for example, list application controller, here it's going to be a list of application controller, right? So since our build function is initialized, since our build function is the first to run inside our application controller, right? What we are simply going to do is we are going to just watch. We are going to initialize our application repository provider, right? And then we are going to do the same thing for our local auth repository. All right, so now what we are simply going to do is let's going to return an async value. And then none. Okay, so now that we are done, now the first thing is we need to work on our method for sending the user application. So it's going to be a future of type void, and then the method is going to be a send application. And then it's going to be string vacancy ID. And then resume, we also need a resume ID. And then we also need a company ID. And then we also need a user ID. And then we also need application status. And then we need a build context. Okay, so now what we simply have to do is application repository and then send application. Okay, so let's just make sure status and then just make sure it's going to caps lock I. And then it's going to be an asynchronous function, right? All right, and then after this, what we simply need to do is we need to create another method for getting our vacancies, right? Application model, and then let's get user applications. Then user ID. And then what let's also create variable. So I'm going to our application repository.get user applications, right? And then we are simply going to return a switch statement. Application extension, right? So if we have an error, we are simply going to represent it with left, right, using fp package, and then we are simply going to throw that error. And then otherwise, what we are simply going to do is we'll simply return error, right? And then let's just import fp package, right? So yeah, we forgot to handle this method, right? So what we're simply going to do here is we need to take care of let's just create a switch statement, right? On our user, on our application, right? And then then we are simply going to display a snake bar, right? Message. And then if it's successful, what we want to do is we'll simply take the user to application confirmation screen, right? To the application confirmation screen, right? So we just say navigator your push name, right? And then here we just provide the route name. For now, let's just use okay, let's create a screen and then let's just name it application confirmation screen.dat. Then let's just make it a stateless widget. Okay, so up now that we're done, let's just go and change it inside our routes folder, right? So inside our route folder, let's just paste it below. Let's copy it and then let's paste it here. Right, and then we also need to do the same thing for application screen because we also have an application screen. So let's just paste it below and then let's just remove this and then let's just leave application screen and then application screen, right? And then let's go inside our main.dat file and then let's just copy this file here. Let's copy it, let's paste it below, and then it's routes with application confirmation screen, and then application confirmation screen there, right? And then we also have we'll do the same thing for the routes application screen, right? Application screen and then application screen. Right, so let's go here and then push and then we just call our routes dot apply. Okay, let's import our routes file, application confirmation screen there. Okay, so now what we simply have to do here is supposed to be a semicolon here and then semicolon here. Okay, so now that we are done, let's create a provider, application controller provider, right? So I think we also have something that's missing here. We have a semicolon that's missing. So let's create a application controller provider, which is async notifier provider, and then we'll just pass in our application controller and then async value type void. Okay, and then application controller. right? And then we need another method for getting user application. So we just call it get final get user applications. And then which is going to be a future provider. And then since we have also have a parameter, so we use the family function. And then we have a reference, and then we have string user ID, which is our argument, right? So it must be supposed to be user ID. And then we are simply going to return reference watch application controller provider dot notify, right? Then dot get user applications, right? Right. So now that we are done here, now it's time for us to move on to our user interface, right? Start building our user interface. Okay guys, now we are moving on to the user interface. As you can see, now we are going to be getting our applications from our backend server, right? So as you can see, we have three types of applications: the applications that are pending, applications that are accepted, and applications that are rejected, right? So without wasting much of the time, let's start writing the logic for this for our application, right? So the first thing that we are going to do here is we need to work on the application screen, right? We need to work on the application screen at first, right? So without doing that much, we need to create an application list screen, right? So what this application list screen is going to have, like in our constructor, we need to pass in the list of screens, right? So we need to pass in the list of applications, right? So then say application model and then applications, right? Because we want to filter applications that are pending, applications that are accepted, and applications that are rejected, right? And then inside our constructor, we need to just pass in a required parameter, these dot applications, right? And then we need to get rid of this constant since our data is going to be dynamic, right? Okay. So now what we need to do is we need to create an application item widget, right? So inside our widgets, let's create a new file. I'm just going to name it application item widget. So it's going to be a stateless widget. Application app item widget, right? And then what we are simply going to do here is we simply need to return a single child score view, right? Single child score view. We need to return a single child score view. And then the child is simply going to be a card widget, and then elevation is going to be 5. And then we also need the color. So the color is going to be colors.white, right? Okay, right. And then inside this card, we also need the column widget, right? And then we also need the main axis alignment and the cross axis alignment, right? So the main axis alignment is going to be main axis alignment dot start. Same with the cross axis alignment is going to be cross axis alignment dot start. Okay, now we need a children property that is going to take a list of widgets, right? So inside our list of widgets, what we need at first is a raw widget, right? Let's create a raw widget that is going to take in children, and then the first one is going to be a text, right? As you can see from, if I pull out our emulator here, you can see here we have like application status, right? So it's going to be a raw widget. Then simply going to say application status. Then it's going to be application model. Okay, so our application item widget must have an application model inside our constructor, right? And then it's going to be required this.application, right? And then let's just remove this constant because we are dealing with dynamic data, right? So it's going to be application.status, right? And then we also need to style our text, right? With our text type. Okay, and then the color is simply colors.black. And then we also need a font size of 15. And then font weight, which is going to be font weight.bold. And then after this row, what we simply need to do is we simply have to pass in the vacancy application widget. Simply have to pass in the vacancy application widget, which we are going to create. Okay, so let's create it inside our widgets folder, vacancy application widget. Let's get rid of this. Let's just create here. Vacancy application widget, and then we need a vacancy. Okay, so let's just import the vacancy model here. Then let's just pass it inside our constructor. So let's just put in a required keyword. Right, so yeah, it's going to be a column widget. Then main axis alignment, we have main axis alignment dot start. And then also have cross axis alignment dot start. And then we need also the children. And then text, it's going to be vacancy, title to string. And then we also need to style it. Style widget. And font size is going to be 20, and then the color is going to be then also need to give it like a font weight of bold, right? Okay, the weight must be, let's just say W7. Okay. And then after this, we just have a size box. Let's just give it a height of 10, like this, and then we are done. Then let's just grab our text widget with the padding widget, right? With the padding widget. Okay, so let's go back and then let's import the vacancy application widget right there, right? So takes the vacancy, and then we're simply going to pass in application dot vacancy. So it's going to be nullable. So let's just make sure it's nullable like that. Okay. And then after this, what we need is text just displaying the company name. So if I pull out my emulator, you can see here the vacancy title is backend developer, and then we have the company name there. So what I'm simply going to do is application dot company dot name to string, right? Make sure that convert it to a string. So the name can be nullable, right? And then we just need to style it. So we just give it a color of black. Then font size of 15. And then also font weight, we just give it a font weight bold. Okay, so now we are done with the application item widget. What we simply have to do is we just need to wrap around our card with the padding widget so that it doesn't get stuck to the wall. If you see from our emulator here, we have this nice padding there. Okay, now that we are done, I think we still have a red squiggly line here. So okay, now that we are done, what we simply need to do is we need to go back to our application list. We need to go back to our application list widget, right? application list screen, right? So let's just deal with our application list screen. Okay, so here what we simply have to do is we simply have to return a list view dot builder. We are using builder property. So let's get rid of this return statement. We already have one there. Okay, so first things first, we need the item count, which is going to be applications.length, right? And then after that, we have to deal with the application builder. So what we simply have to do to deal with the application builder, get a method that takes in a context and then takes in again an index. Then after that, we are simply going to turn the application item widget, and then for the application, what we simply have to do here, we simply provide the application in its relative. So now we are done with the application list screen, right? Now it's time to deal with the application screen now. So let's go inside our application screen and then let's start writing the logic. So this application screen must be a stateful widget. And then it's going to be application screen, right? And then since we are going to consume Riverpod providers, we simply have to change it to consumer widget. And then we need to change this one to consumer state, right? Consumer state, and then also consumer state, right? Let's just import Flutter Riverpod there. Okay, so what we are simply going to do is an error. Okay, so let's get rid of this one. It is saying application state is not valid. Okay, I think we made a mistake, so let's just get rid of this and let's try again. So step widget, then application. Okay. So now it's simply going to be consumer stateful widget, right? Then consumer state. Consumer state and also consumer state. Okay, right, now that we are done, what we simply have to do here is we simply have to extend with sing state provider state mixing, because for our tab controller, we are going to inject a state for every ticker, right? So we use single ticker provider state mixing, right? So since it's a tab, let's just create a variable late tab controller. So let's create this variable outside of the build statement. It must be outside of the build statement, right? So let's just paste it here. inside of the build statement, and then after this, what we are simply going to do is the init state, right? And then what we are simply going to initialize the state, and then going to set our check controller to be equal to check controller, and then the length is going to be 3. Then our vsync, we are just this key statement, right? All right, so now that we are done, inside our build folder, what we need is we need the user ID. So we'll get the user ID from our local auth repository, right? Reference.watch local auth repository. Then .get user ID, right? And then we want to get applications, right, from our backend. So to get them, what we're simply going to do is we're simply going to watch the get user application provider, and then we need to pass in the user ID. User ID .toString. Okay, so now that we are done, what we simply have to do here is we simply have to create, we simply have to return a scaffold widget. And then we just make sure that we have an up bar, and then up bar. And then we also want to get rid of that back button on the up bar. Right? So basically, to do that, what we simply have to do is we need to set automatically imply leading to false. Right, so now that we are done, we need a title, and then title with a text, and then our text is going to be my job applications. Right, and then after this, what we simply have to do is we simply have to style the title. Then color is going to be black. And then font size is going to be 20. And then we also have to take care of the font weight, right? Which is going to be bold. Right, so now that we are done, now we need a tab bar, right? The bottom, so we need to provide a tab bar. So what we simply have to do here is, let's go here, bottom, and then we'll simply say tab bar, and then you can see it has these tabs. So these tabs, and then we need to provide the indicator color at first. Indicator color, which is going to be, let's just make sure that it's orange, right? And then the next thing is our controller. So for our controller, we are simply going to pass the tab controller that we created, right? Tab controller. And then we need the tabs. So for our tabs, you know that we only have 3 tabs. We have text, we have the pending accepted and then rejected. Pending first, and then we have our style, which is going to be a check style. And then color is to black. And then font size, let's say 15. And then the font weight, we are simply going to make sure that the weight is bold. Right. Right, so what we basically have to do now is let's just copy this text right here. And let's just paste it below. Paste it below since we have 3 tabs. Right, so I'm just going to change. The first one is pending, second one is accepted. And then the last one is rejected. Okay. All right, so now that we are done with this, so what we need to do is we need to filter our vacancies according to their application status, right? So to do this, what we simply do is let's create a list with our applications, right? A list of our application. So list application model, right? And then this list, we are simply going to name it filtered applications, right? We are simply going to name it filtered applications. And then it's going to take in a list of applications, right? It's going to take in a list of applications, and then it's going to take in again a string of type status, right? And then what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to filter applications according to their what? According to their status. So what we simply do is we are going to return applications, where, right, where the element of the application, right, is equal to element status, right, which is going to be equal to status that we want, right? And then after we do this, we are simply going to convert this to, okay. So basically what we are doing here is we simply created a method for filtering applications, and then this method, what it does is it takes in our list of applications and then our application status, right? And then we are going to simply check if the element that we have, the status of that element is going to be equal to the status that we are going to assign. That means if it's equal to pending, we are going to return only vacancies with pending status, right? If it's accepted, we are going to return vacancies with accepted status, right? Okay. So now that we've done that, let's now take care of getting our applications, right? So since we have a scaffold widget, we also need a body. On our body, we are going to say applications dot when, right? And then when we have the data, what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to return a tab bar view, right? We are simply going to return a tab bar view, and then that tab bar is going to take in a controller, and then the controller is going to be our tab controller. Tab controller, and then we also have children, right? So for the children, we're simply going to return screens, right? And then we're simply going to return an application list screen, and then what we are simply here going to do here, we are going to pass in a filtered applications, right? And then we'll simply pass in our data. We'll simply pass in our data, which is coming from our backend, right? And then we also pass in the status. In this case, the status is going to be pending. So it's supposed to be applications, right? And then let's copy this. Let's copy. Then let's do the same for our accepted and rejected. Then rejected. And then we are simply going to handle errors, right? Stack trace. We're simply going to display text. Then error to string. And then if we are still loading, we are simply going to show a loader. All right, so now we are done with the application. So what I'm simply going to do here is I'm simply going to run an emulator, and then we'll see how it's coming out. So let's, okay, iPhone 17. Okay, let's try it. Okay. Okay, so now the emulator has finished loading. You can see we have pending, accepted, and also rejected. But the thing is, like, you can see we have this company name and application status are close to our card. So what we simply have to do is, let's go back to our application item widget, right? So let's go back to our application item widget. So basically what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to have this text with the padding widget, right? So let's wrap it around with the padding widget. Let's do the same for, let's do the same for this widget, right? We must wrap it around with the padding widget. So let's wrap it around with the padding widget. Then if I reload, let's see if it's still doing the same thing. Okay, we are left with the bottom. Yeah. So let's wrap it around with the padding widget. Okay. So now you can see now, let's go to the upper part, and then let's just remove this padding here. Already have another padding widget inside our row widget. So as you can see now, we now have this nice cut view right there. Okay, so thanks for watching, guys. That was it on getting applications from our backend, right? So in the next video, we are going to be working on sending applications, right? So thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.